Title: Inside one of Canada's most notorious prisons, Stony Mountain. Help this channel grow. Like the video, leave a comment, subscribe, and don't forget to turn on your notification for our next real-life prison stories. This helps us a lot. Thank you. The story begins inside one of Canada's most notorious prisons, Stony Mountain. On a freezing February morning in 2019, correctional officers at Stony Mountain Institution discovered something that would expose the truth about who really runs Canada's oldest federal penitentiary. Inside cell block D, they found a fully operational tattoo parlor, complete with professional equipment, a waiting list of clients, and payment records showing thousands of dollars changing hands. But the tattoo shop was just the beginning. Behind the needles and ink sat a network so organized, so deeply embedded in the prison's daily operations, that some guards had stopped trying to fight it years ago. The question wasn't whether gangs controlled Stony Mountain. The question was how they'd managed to turn a maximum security prison into their own city, with its own economy, its own rules, and its own brutal justice system. And the answer would reveal a reality that corrections officials had been hiding from the Canadian public for decades. Stony Mountain sits 17 miles north of Winnipeg, Manitoba, surrounded by flat prairie land where winter temperatures drop to 30 below zero. The prison opened in 1877, making it the oldest continuously operating federal penitentiary in Canada. Its limestone walls stand 30 feet high, built by the first inmates who quarried the stone from the ground beneath their feet. For over a century, those walls were supposed to keep dangerous men contained. But somewhere along the way, something changed. The walls still kept inmates in, but they also kept the outside world from seeing what was happening inside. The prison was designed to hold 584 inmates. By 2015, it held over 650. By 2019, that number had climbed past 700. Overcrowding created pressure. Pressure created opportunity. An opportunity created a power vacuum that gangs rushed to fill. The Native Syndicate arrived first, recruiting heavily from Manitoba's indigenous communities, where poverty and trauma fed a pipeline directly into the criminal justice system. Then came the Manitoba Warriors, the Indian Posse, and the Hells Angels support crews. Each group carved out territory inside the prison. Each group needed income. And each group discovered that Stony Mountain's aging infrastructure and understaffed guard force created perfect conditions for building criminal enterprises behind bars. The tattoo parlor in cell block D wasn't just about art. Tattoos marked loyalty, identified gang affiliation, and communicated rank. They were advertisements, resumes, and contracts written in ink on skin. The fact that inmates could operate a professional shop openly meant guards either couldn't stop them or wouldn't. Internal investigations later suggested both were true. Correctional Service Canada employed around 400 staff at Stony Mountain. On any given shift, maybe 40 guards monitored 700 inmates spread across multiple cell blocks, the segregation unit, the minimum security farm annex, and various workshop buildings. The math didn't work. Guards couldn't be everywhere. They couldn't see everything. And over time, they started making choices about what to ignore. A former Stony Mountain correctional officer spoke to reporters in 2020 under condition of anonymity. He described a workplace where staff members were outnumbered, exhausted, and increasingly afraid. Some guards developed working relationships with gang leaders, trading information or small favors for cooperation. Others simply stayed out of certain areas unless backup was available. The officer estimated that at least 20% of the prison operated under inmate control rather than official authority. This wasn't chaos. It was order. Just not the kind written in the rule books. Gangs needed structure to survive inside. They established hierarchies, territories, and rules. Breaking these rules carried consequences that official disciplinary procedures couldn't match. In the prison's official system, an inmate might face segregation or loss of privileges. In the gang system, punishment was immediate and physical. This parallel justice system existed because it worked. It resolved disputes quickly, enforced debts, and maintained a brutal kind of stability that kept violence from spiraling completely out of control. But stability built on fear was always fragile. And in March 2016, that fragility showed itself when a dispute over drug territory sparked the worst violence Stony Mountain had seen in years. It started in the cafeteria during lunch. Witnesses reported seeing two inmates exchange words near the serving line. Within seconds, 15 men were involved. Guards hit the alarm, but by the time the emergency response team arrived, 3 inmates were on the floor with serious injuries. One man had been stabbed 17 times with a homemade weapon fashioned from a sharpened piece of metal bed frame. He survived, but the incident revealed how quickly the prison's fragile order could collapse. Investigators reviewing security footage discovered that several inmates had positioned themselves to block camera angles during the fight. Others had created a distraction on the opposite side of the cafeteria, pulling guards out of position. The attack wasn't spontaneous rage. It was planned, coordinated, and executed with military precision. The question corrections officials couldn't answer was simple. How did inmates organize something this sophisticated while under constant surveillance? The answer would take investigators deep into the prison's economy, where they'd discover that Stony Mountain wasn't just controlled by gangs. It was being run like a business. The economy. Money doesn't officially exist inside Stony Mountain. Inmates aren't allowed to possess cash. They have canteen accounts managed by the prison, where they can purchase approved items like snacks, toiletries, and writing supplies. But this official economy was tiny compared to the underground market that operated in every cell block, every workshop, and every corner of the prison yard. The underground economy at Stony Mountain dealt in drugs, phones, weapons, protection, and services. Everything had a price. Everything could be traded. And gangs controlled the supply chains. Drugs entered the prison through multiple routes. Some were smuggled during contact visits, passed between family members and inmates in moments when guards looked away. Others arrived with corrupt staff members who were paid to look the other way or actively participate. In 2018, an investigation by the Correctional Service Canada found that nearly 40% of random drug tests at Stony Mountain came back positive. The drugs being found weren't just marijuana. Investigators detected methamphetamine, fentanyl, and synthetic cannabinoids that were far more dangerous than anything available on the streets in the 1990s. A single gram of methamphetamine might cost $80 on Winnipeg streets. Inside Stony Mountain, that same gram sold for $300. The markup was enormous, and gangs fought viciously to control distribution networks. But drugs were just one commodity. Cell phones were even more valuable. Phones allowed inmates to coordinate criminal activity outside the prison, communicate with gang members on the street, and maintain control over operations they'd been running before their arrest. A basic smartphone that cost $200 outside could sell for $2,000 inside. Guards conducted regular cell searches and used metal detectors, but phones kept appearing. Some were thrown over the walls at predetermined times and locations. Others were smuggled in body cavities during transfers from other institutions. The most sophisticated operations involved drone deliveries, with packages dropped into the prison yard during recreation time when hundreds of inmates were outside and guards couldn't track who grabbed what. In 2019, guards at Stony Mountain confiscated over 150 cell phones. Experts estimated that represented maybe 20% of phones actually in circulation. The other 80% remained hidden, powering an invisible network that let gang leaders inside maintain command of criminal operations outside. But the prison economy wasn't just about drugs and phones. It included services that met basic human needs the official system failed to provide. Gangs ran gambling operations, loan services, and protection rackets. They controlled access to desirable jobs within the prison, like kitchen work or maintenance positions that provided freedom of movement. They operated phone charging stations powered by electricity stolen from workshop outlets. They even controlled the prison's social hierarchy, determining who ate where in the cafeteria, who exercised when in the yard, and who got access to scarce resources like hot water or clean clothes. An inmate arriving at Stony Mountain for the first time faced immediate choices: align with a gang for protection, or try to navigate independently and risk becoming a target. Most chose protection, which meant owing loyalty and potentially participating in the gang's activities. This system perpetuated itself, creating a cycle where gang membership offered safety while also making inmates more criminal than when they'd arrived. Former inmates described a world where official prison rules mattered less than gang codes. A man could break institutional regulations and face minor consequences, but breaking gang rules could result in serious violence. This parallel system of justice meant that guards had effectively ceded portions of their authority to inmates who enforced order through fear. But gang control wasn't absolute. Rival groups competed for territory and resources, and that competition sometimes exploded into violence that even gang leaders couldn't contain. In October 2017, a dispute over drug debts escalated into a full-scale riot that required intervention from riot police brought in from outside the facility. It started during evening recreation when two inmates from rival gangs confronted each other in the wait area. Words were exchanged, then punches. Within minutes, over 60 inmates were involved in running battles across the prison yard. Guards retreated to secure positions and called for backup. The riot lasted 4 hours. When it ended, the prison was on lockdown, 8 inmates required hospitalization, and investigators discovered that the violence had been triggered by a debt of less than $500. The riot exposed how little control staff actually had when gangs decided to fight. It also revealed the economic pressures driving violence. As drug prices inside the prison increased and as debts accumulated, disputes that might have been resolved with conversation instead turned deadly. The underground economy created stakes high enough that inmates were willing to risk additional charges, injuries, and years in segregation. Correctional Service Canada launched an investigation after the riot. They implemented new security measures, increased cell searches, and promised better staff training. But former employees said the real problem wasn't security equipment or training programs. The problem was that gangs had become so embedded in the prison's functioning that removing them would require completely rebuilding how Stony Mountain operated. And nobody had the resources or political will to do that. So the economy continued. Drugs flowed. Phones appeared. Debts accumulated. And violence waited just beneath the surface, ready to erupt whenever the fragile balance between rival groups shifted. The system. The question that haunted corrections officials, journalists, and families of inmates was always the same: how did it get this bad? Stony Mountain didn't become gang-controlled overnight. It happened gradually, through a combination of policy failures, budget cuts, and institutional neglect that spanned decades. In the 1990s, Canada's federal prison system faced pressure to reduce costs. Staff numbers were cut even as inmate populations grew. Training programs were reduced. Maintenance budgets shrank. At Stony Mountain, these cuts meant aging infrastructure fell into disrepair, creating blind spots where surveillance cameras didn't work and areas where guards couldn't patrol safely. Gangs recognized these vulnerabilities and exploited them. By the early 2000s, gang presence at Stony Mountain was well established, but corrections officials treated it as a security issue rather than a systemic problem. They focused on confiscating contraband and breaking up fights rather than addressing why gangs thrived in the first place. This reactive approach meant staff were always responding to problems instead of preventing them. Former correctional officer Michael Chen worked at Stony Mountain from 2008 to 2015. In an interview with the Winnipeg Free Press in 2020, he described a workplace where guards felt abandoned by management. "We'd report gang activity, write up incidents, document everything," Chen said. But nothing changed. The same inmates kept running the same operations. After a while, you realize the system isn't designed to actually stop this. It's designed to contain it just enough that it doesn't make headlines. Chen's observation pointed to a deeper truth. Gang control served certain institutional interests. Gangs maintained order in ways that official systems couldn't. They resolved disputes, enforced debts, and created a hierarchical structure that made the prison more predictable for staff. As long as violence stayed below certain thresholds and as long as gangs didn't directly challenge guard authority, administrators could claim the prison was functioning adequately. This unofficial arrangement worked until it didn't. The 2017 riot showed what happened when gang peace collapsed. The 2019 discovery of the tattoo parlor showed how deeply embedded criminal enterprises had become. Each incident prompted investigations, recommendations, and promises of reform. But former staff members said real change never came because it would require admitting that Canada's correctional system had fundamentally failed. The impact of gang control extended far beyond Stony Mountain's walls. Inmates who joined gangs for protection inside often maintained those affiliations after release. This created a pipeline that fed Manitoba's street gang problem, with men leaving prison more connected to criminal networks than when they'd arrived. Recidivism rates reflected this cycle. Studies showed that inmates involved with gangs at Stony Mountain had a 70% chance of returning to prison within 5 years of release. Families of inmates described the impossible situation their loved ones faced. A mother whose son served time at Stony Mountain from 2014 to 2018 told reporters that her son had no gang affiliation when he entered prison. Within 6 months, he joined the Native Syndicate because he'd been assaulted twice by inmates from rival groups. He had to choose between joining them or getting hurt worse, she said. The prison didn't protect him. The gang did. Her son's experience wasn't unique. Advocates estimated that 30 to 40% of Stony Mountain's population had some gang affiliation. For many, that affiliation began inside as a survival strategy. Correctional Service Canada maintained that gang activity was a challenge at all federal institutions, not just Stony Mountain. They pointed to gang intervention programs, increased security measures, and partnerships with law enforcement. But critics noted that these programs were voluntary, underfunded, and reached only a small fraction of gang-involved inmates. In 2021, the Office of the Correctional Investigator released a report examining gang activity across Canada's federal prison system. The report found that Indigenous inmates were disproportionately represented in gang populations, reflecting broader patterns of systemic discrimination and poverty. At Stony Mountain, where Indigenous inmates made up over 60% of the population, this overrepresentation was especially stark. The report concluded that without addressing the social conditions that funneled Indigenous men into prisons, gang control would continue. The report also highlighted how gang control made rehabilitation nearly impossible. Educational programs, vocational training, and mental health services existed at Stony Mountain, but inmates often couldn't access them without gang permission. A man trying to better himself by attending classes or counseling might be seen as disloyal to his gang, creating pressure to remain involved in criminal activity instead of pursuing positive changes. This dynamic trapped inmates in cycles of violence and crime even when they wanted to escape. Former gang members described the difficulty of leaving gang life while still incarcerated. Leaving meant losing protection, becoming a target for violence, and facing isolation from the only community that had offered support. Many chose to maintain gang ties until release, then tried to disengage once outside. But by that point, connections were deep, debts existed, and street-level gang members expected continued loyalty. The correctional officers who remained at Stony Mountain despite the challenges often felt caught between impossible demands. They were expected to maintain security with inadequate staff numbers, rehabilitate inmates within a system that bred criminality, and manage gang conflicts that originated in communities far beyond the prison walls. Some guards burned out within years. Others adapted by lowering expectations and accepting that certain aspects of the prison would remain beyond their control. In 2022, Correctional Service Canada announced new initiatives targeting gang activity at Stony Mountain. They promised better intelligence gathering, improved staff training, and increased use of segregation for identified gang leaders. They also pledged more funding for programs addressing the root causes of gang involvement, including trauma counseling and cultural programming for Indigenous inmates. Former inmates and advocates responded with skepticism. They'd heard similar promises before. Unless the fundamental issues were addressed, unless overcrowding was reduced, unless staff received adequate resources, unless communities received support to break cycles of poverty and trauma, nothing would truly change. As of late 2024, gang presence at Stony Mountain remained significant. Drugs continued to enter the prison. Phones continued to appear. Violence continued to erupt. The parallel justice system continued to operate alongside official authority. And men continued to enter the prison looking for rehabilitation but often found only deeper involvement in criminal networks. The story of Stony Mountain wasn't just about one prison in Manitoba. It reflected broader failures in Canada's approach to incarceration, rehabilitation, and justice. It showed what happened when society locked people away without addressing the conditions that led to crime in the first place. And it revealed how gangs could flourish in environments where official systems failed to meet basic human needs for safety, belonging, and dignity. The tattoo parlor discovered in Cell Block D in 2019 was dismantled. The equipment was confiscated. The inmates involved faced disciplinary action. But within months, reports suggested similar operations had started in other areas of the prison. Because the demand hadn't changed. The conditions hadn't changed. And the gangs that filled the void left by failing institutions hadn't changed. Inside Stony Mountain, the walls still stand 30 feet high. They still keep inmates contained. But they've never kept the truth from eventually getting out. And the truth is that for decades, Canada's oldest federal penitentiary has been controlled not by the people paid to run it, but by the inmates who've built their own systems of power in the spaces where official authority failed to reach. The question now isn't whether gangs control portions of Stony Mountain. The question is whether Canadian society has the will to build a corrections system that actually corrects, rather than one that simply warehouses people until their humanity becomes another commodity traded in the prison's underground economy. The reckoning. The breaking point came on a January morning in 2023 when a 23-year-old correctional officer named Sarah Thompkins didn't show up for her shift at Stony Mountain. Her supervisor called her cell phone. No answer. They called her emergency contact. Her roommate said Sarah had left for work at her usual time, 6 in the morning. Her car was found in the staff parking lot. But Sarah was gone. The disappearance triggered an immediate lockdown. Every cell was searched. Every inmate was interviewed. Security footage was reviewed frame by frame. What investigators found changed everything the public thought they knew about gang control at Stony Mountain. Because Sarah Thompkins hadn't been kidnapped. She'd walked away voluntarily after discovering something so dangerous that staying meant risking her life. 3 weeks earlier, Sarah had been assigned to supervise a maintenance crew repairing a water leak in the prison's east wing. The crew included 4 inmates, all considered low-security risks, all selected for good behavior. One of them was a man named James Keeper, serving 12 years for armed robbery. Sarah had worked with Keeper before. He was quiet, polite, and never caused problems. But that afternoon, while the other inmates worked on the pipes, Keeper approached Sarah with a piece of paper folded tight in his palm. He pressed it into her hand and whispered 6 words, "They're going to kill another guard." Sarah didn't unfold the paper until she was alone in the staff bathroom. Inside were 3 names. 2 were correctional officers she worked with. The third was her own name. Below the names was a date, February 15th. Below the date was a single word, payment. Sarah reported it immediately to her supervisor. He thanked her, told her they'd investigate, and asked her not to discuss it with other staff members. That was the last official response she received. Days passed. No investigation seemed to be happening. The 2 other officers whose names appeared on the list continued working their normal shifts. Nobody was pulled aside for questioning. Nobody was reassigned for safety. Sarah started to wonder if her supervisor had even filed a report. She couldn't let it go. Sarah started asking careful questions, talking to guards who'd worked at Stony Mountain longer than her 6 months on the job. What she learned terrified her. The threat wasn't random. It was part of a pattern that had been building for years. In 2018, a correctional officer named David Reimer had been assaulted in the prison parking lot after his shift. 2 masked men attacked him with metal pipes, fracturing his skull and breaking both his arms. The attackers were never caught, but inmates later bragged that it was retaliation for Reimer confiscating phones from members of the Manitoba Warriors. Reimer survived but never returned to work. The incident was officially classified as a random assault unrelated to his job. In 2020, a female guard named Patricia Coate found her home vandalized with gang symbols spray-painted across her garage door. The message was clear: "We know where you live." Coate had been leading efforts to crack down on drug trafficking in her cell block. After the vandalism, she requested a transfer to a different institution. Her request was approved within days. No investigation into the vandalism was ever completed. Sarah realized the pattern. Guards who aggressively challenged gang operations faced consequences. Sometimes the consequences came inside the prison. Sometimes they followed guards home. And corrections management seemed more interested in transferring targeted staff than confronting the gangs making the threats. James Keeper's warning suggested something worse was coming. The word payment implied the threats against the 3 guards were connected to a debt. But what kind of debt required killing correctional officers? Sarah started digging through incident reports looking for connections. She found them in a series of seizures that had happened over the previous 6 months. In August, guards had confiscated a major drug shipment hidden in a delivery of kitchen supplies. Nearly 2 kilograms of methamphetamine, street value of about $50,000, prison value possibly 3 times that. In September, a cell search uncovered 18 smartphones and evidence of a sophisticated communication network connecting inmates at Stony Mountain with gang members across Western Canada. In October, guards intercepted a drone delivery containing fentanyl, more phones, and Canadian currency totaling $8,000. Each seizure represented a massive financial loss for the gangs operating inside Stony Mountain. The drugs alone totaled hundreds of thousands in lost revenue. The phones disrupted communication networks that took months to build. The intercepted cash was probably just a fraction of what was moving through the prison, but losing it still hurt. Sarah cross-referenced the seizures with the names of officers involved. The pattern became clear. All 3 guards whose names appeared on Keeper's list had participated in major busts. One had been part of the team that found the kitchen supply drugs. Another had conducted the cell search that uncovered the phones. Sarah herself had been on duty the night the drone delivery was intercepted. She'd been the one who spotted the drone's lights and called for backup. The gangs weren't just threatening guards for interference. They were planning retaliation for specific financial losses. The February 15th date was probably when they'd accumulated enough resources to carry out the attacks. And the word payment meant exactly what Sarah feared. 3 guards were going to pay with their lives for the gang's lost profits. She took her findings to her supervisor again. He listened, nodded, and told her the same thing: they'd look into it. But Sarah noticed he didn't take notes. He didn't ask for copies of her research. He barely seemed concerned. That's when Sarah understood something that made her blood run cold. Her supervisor already knew. Management already knew. And they weren't going to do anything about it. The reasons became clear when Sarah started connecting different dots. Stony Mountain had operated for years with an unofficial arrangement. Gangs maintained internal order, and guards looked the other way on certain activities. The major seizures in recent months had disrupted that arrangement. Gangs were angry. But corrections management was also angry because the seizures had created instability. Violence had increased. Tensions were high. The fragile peace that let the prison function with minimal staffing was breaking down. Sarah believed her supervisor's inaction was calculated. If the threatened guards left either through fear or through violence, they'd be replaced with officers who understood not to disrupt gang operations too aggressively. The system would return to its dysfunctional equilibrium. Management could continue claiming the prison was secure while avoiding the massive overhaul that real gang suppression would require. But Sarah couldn't accept being sacrificed for bureaucratic convenience. She documented everything she'd found. She made copies of incident reports, security logs, and her own notes. She created a file that connected the seizures, the threats, and management's inaction. Then she contacted a journalist at the Winnipeg Free Press who'd written about prison issues before. The journalist's name was Michael Fontaine. He'd been investigating Stony Mountain for 3 years, publishing stories about overcrowding, gang violence, and staff shortages. When Sarah reached out, he responded immediately. They met at a coffee shop 20 miles from the prison. Sarah handed him the file and told him everything. Fontaine spent 2 weeks verifying Sarah's information. He interviewed former inmates, talked to other guards off the record, and filed Freedom of Information requests for official documentation. Everything Sarah had told him checked out. He prepared a major investigative piece exposing gang retaliation against correctional officers and management's failure to protect staff. The article was scheduled to publish on February 10th, 5 days before the date on Keeper's warning. But Sarah never saw it published. Because on the morning of January 23rd, she discovered her car had been tampered with. The brake lines were cut. If she hadn't checked her fluid levels before leaving for work, she might have died in a crash on the highway. Sarah called the police. They filed a report but said they couldn't prove the tampering was related to her job. She called her supervisor. He suggested she take some personal leave to reduce stress. She called Fontaine. He told her to get somewhere safe immediately. That's when Sarah made the decision that would expose everything. She didn't go home. She didn't go to work. She drove to a hotel in another city, checked in under a false name, and called every media outlet she could find. She told her story to anyone who would listen. She explained the threats, the retaliation, the institutional complicity. She became a whistleblower not because she wanted attention, but because staying silent meant dying. The story exploded. Within 48 hours, Sarah Thompkins was on national news. The other 2 guards whose names appeared on the threat list were placed in protective custody. Stony Mountain went into emergency lockdown. The Royal Canadian Mounted Police launched a criminal investigation. And Michael Fontaine's article ran on the front page of the Winnipeg Free Press with documentation that corrections officials couldn't deny. Public outrage was immediate. How had gangs gained so much power they could order hits on correctional officers? Why had management ignored warnings? What was being done to protect staff and reform the institution? Politicians demanded answers. Prison reform advocates renewed calls for systemic change. Families of inmates asked how their loved ones could be rehabilitated in an environment this corrupt. The RCMP investigation uncovered evidence that confirmed Sarah's warnings. Communications intercepted from confiscated phones showed gang members discussing, teaching guards a lesson, and making examples of officers who'd cost them money. The investigation identified several inmates believed to be planning the attacks, though proving conspiracy to commit murder would be difficult without more direct evidence. More disturbing was what investigators found about institutional knowledge. Internal emails showed that concerns about gang retaliation had been raised multiple times over the previous year. Some supervisors had recommended increased security for officers involved in major seizures. Those recommendations were denied due to budget constraints. The choice had been made. Money mattered more than staff safety. The superintendent of Stony Mountain was placed on administrative leave. Several senior corrections officials were reassigned. The federal minister responsible for correctional services faced calls to resign. But former staff members said the personnel changes missed the point. The problem wasn't individual bad actors. The problem was a system that had allowed gangs to become so embedded that challenging them created genuine danger for staff. James Keeper, the inmate who'd warned Sarah, was transferred to a different institution for his own protection. Other inmates who'd provided information to investigators were also moved. But the gangs remained. The power structures remained. And the fundamental conditions that created gang control remained unchanged. In March 2023, the federal government announced a comprehensive review of gang activity across Canada's prison system. They promised more funding, better training, improved intelligence gathering, and stronger anti-gang initiatives. They pledged to end the culture of complacency that had endangered staff and undermined rehabilitation. Prison reform advocates welcomed the attention but questioned whether political promises would translate into real change. They pointed out that similar reviews had been conducted in 1996, 2007, and 2015. Each time, reports were written, recommendations were made, and conditions barely improved. The core issues, overcrowding, underfunding, systemic racism, poverty pipelines, remained unaddressed. Sarah Thompkins never returned to Stony Mountain. She accepted a job with a victim advocacy organization, using her experience to push for better protections for correctional staff nationwide. In interviews, she emphasized that guards weren't the enemy of reform. Many officers wanted to help inmates rehabilitate but couldn't do so safely in environments controlled by gangs. The two other guards from the threat list also left corrections work. One moved to a different province. The other started a security consulting business. Both said they loved the idea of helping people but couldn't risk their lives in a system that wouldn't protect them. By late 2023, conditions at Stony Mountain had stabilized somewhat. The emergency lockdown procedures and increased security presence had reduced overt gang activity. Violence decreased. Drug seizures declined, which some observers noted might mean smuggling had just gotten more sophisticated rather than stopping. The underground economy adapted as it always did. But the fundamental questions raised by Sarah's case remained unanswered. How could Canada claim to operate a just correctional system when gangs wielded more practical power than guards in some institutions? How could rehabilitation happen in environments where criminal organizations offered more security than official protection? How could society break cycles of incarceration when prisons themselves deepen gang involvement? Former Stony Mountain inmate Marcus Sinclair, released in 2022 after serving 8 years, spoke about these questions in a 2024 interview. Sinclair had joined the Native Syndicate within months of arriving at the prison. "I didn't want to be in a gang," he said, "but I wanted to survive. The gang gave me protection the guards couldn't provide. They gave me structure when the programs were full. They gave me belonging when the system treated me like a number." Sinclair described rehabilitation as nearly impossible under gang control. You can't focus on changing your life when you're worried about getting stabbed over a drug debt. You can't attend counseling when gang business demands your time. You can't plan for a future outside when your survival inside depends on loyalty to people who'll expect you to keep doing crime after release. After release, Sinclair tried to leave gang life behind. It wasn't easy. Former associates expected continued loyalty. Some debts followed him outside. It took moving to a different city, changing his phone number, and cutting ties with people he'd known for years. He succeeded in staying out of prison, but he estimated that 90% of the men he knew from Stony Mountain had returned within 5 years of release. The cycle perpetuated itself endlessly. Young men from marginalized communities, disproportionately indigenous, entered prison for crimes often rooted in poverty and trauma. Inside, they joined gangs for survival. The gang connections deepened their criminality. Upon release, they returned to the same communities with the same lack of opportunities, but now with gang affiliations that made legitimate work harder to find. Many committed new crimes. Many returned to prison. The cycle continued. Breaking this cycle required addressing issues far beyond Stony Mountain's walls. It required economic investment in indigenous communities. It required mental health services and trauma counseling. It required education and job training. It required a justice system focused on healing rather than punishment. These solutions were expensive, complex, and politically difficult. Maintaining the status quo was easier, even if the status quo meant more violence, more victims, and more taxpayer money spent cycling people through a system that made them worse. By 2024, gang presence at Stony Mountain remained significant. New members were recruited. New leaders emerged to replace those transferred or released. The organizational structures adapted to new security measures. The underground economy found new channels when old ones were disrupted. Reports suggested that corrections officials had returned to an uneasy accommodation with gang power, preferring managed coexistence to open warfare. Sarah Thompkins' whistleblowing had exposed the truth, but exposure alone didn't create transformation. It created attention, investigations, promises, and eventually, a return to something resembling normal operations. The gangs were still there. The officers were still outnumbered. The system was still failing. In April 2024, another major drug seizure occurred at Stony Mountain. Guards found 3 kilograms of methamphetamine hidden in a shipment of library books. The discovery made local news. Corrections officials praised staff vigilance. But current and former employees wondered what would happen to the guards who'd made the seizure. Would they face retaliation? Would management protect them? Would history repeat itself? Those questions remained unanswered as investigations continued and as the public's attention moved to other issues. Stony Mountain returned to being invisible again, just another prison holding hundreds of people the rest of society preferred not to think about. The wall still stood. The gang still operated. And the correctional system still failed to correct. The story that began with a folded piece of paper pressed into Sarah Thompkins' hand revealed a truth that extended far beyond one corrupt institution. It showed how Canada's oldest federal penitentiary had become a case study in what happens when society locks people away without addressing the conditions that create crime, without providing resources for real rehabilitation, and without acknowledging that punishment alone never heals. Inside Stony Mountain, men continued serving their sentences. Some genuinely tried to change despite the environment. Some gave up and deepened their gang involvement. Some counted days until release, knowing they'd probably return. Guards continued working in dangerous conditions. Some cared deeply about helping inmates. Some just tried to make it through their shifts safely. Management continued filing reports, adjusting policies, and managing crises. And the gangs continued running their parallel system of power, proving that when official systems fail to meet basic human needs for safety, order, and belonging, people will create their own systems. Those systems might be violent. They might be exploitative. They might make everything worse. But they fill the void left by institutional failure. The question Canada faced wasn't whether to crack down harder on gangs at Stony Mountain. The question was whether Canadian society was willing to build a justice system that actually served justice, that rehabilitated rather than warehoused, that addressed root causes rather than symptoms, and that treated incarcerated people as human beings deserving of safety and opportunity rather than problems to be contained. Until those deeper questions were answered with action rather than rhetoric, Stony Mountain would remain what it had become. A fortress where the wrong people held the power, where survival required joining the very organizations society claimed to want eliminated, and where the cycle of crime and punishment turned endlessly without ever breaking. Sarah Thompkins understood this. That's why she continued advocating for reform even after leaving corrections work. That's why she told her story publicly despite the personal cost. She knew that one whistleblower couldn't fix a broken system. But she also knew that silence guaranteed nothing would ever change. The threats against her life had been real. The institutional betrayal had been real. The danger correctional officers faced was real. But equally real was the suffering of inmates trapped in gang-controlled environments, the grief of families watching loved ones become more criminal with each year behind bars, and the broader social costs of a correction system that corrected nothing. As of January 2025, 2 years after Sarah's disappearance sparked national attention, conditions at Stony Mountain remained largely unchanged. Some security improvements had been implemented. Some additional staff had been hired. Some programs had expanded. But the fundamental dynamics, gangs providing what the system failed to deliver, remained intact. The limestone walls built by inmates in 1877 still stood. They'd witnessed nearly 150 years of incarceration. They'd contained thousands of people. They'd seen violence, suffering, attempted rehabilitation, and countless failures. And they remained solid and permanent, while everything inside them continued to change in ways the architects of Canadian corrections never intended and seemed unable to prevent. Inside Stony Mountain, Canada's gang-controlled prison, the future looked much like the past. Different faces, same patterns. Different gang leaders, same power structures. Different promises of reform, same institutional resistance to real change. The fortress stood. The gangs thrived. And the cycle continued, unbroken.